Hello everybody and welcome back to International Trade. I'm very excited because today we're going to start a new model. This is going to be the Heckscher-Ohlin model and we're going to do it over the course of 2 lectures. And the main motivation for this model is to understand whether international trade can be a cause for the increase in income inequality. In recent years, we've all been very interested in the topic of income inequality, as there have been a lot of protests pretty much everywhere in the world over this. And this all started with the Occupy Wall Street movement in the aftermath of the Great Recession of 2009. These are footage video of the protest in 2011. And with all the, you probably remember the slogan, against the top 1%, and the subsequent rise in the polls by Bernie Sanders. And when we look at the data, indeed, it is the case that income inequality is been on the rise. In this figure, I showed you a graph where the share of the top decile in national income, so how much the top 10% in the United States earns, you can see that that number has been steadily increasing since the 1980s up until today. This figure is very interesting, and it comes from the research of Thomas Piketty, a French economist that I think in 2013 published a book, Capital in the 21st Century, which was very, very successful when it came out. I remember I was in my PhD and everybody was talking about this book, figuring out whether the theory was correct or not. But aside from what you think about the theory suggested by Piketty for the reason of the increase in income inequality, it is without question that he created an incredible source, incredible database to study income inequality across long periods of time and across countries. And in fact, if you look at the website, YID.org, and you select country of Denmark, you can actually see the same figure that I showed you before, but for Denmark. And you could do the same thing for other countries as well. So on the left panel, what we have is the pre-tax national income for the top 10% of individuals in red, and in blue for the bottom 50%. So here you should imagine that you rank order all Danish people from the poorest to the richest. You take the top 10% of those, you take their share of total income, and that's the red line. You see it goes from 24% up until almost 32%. And this is more or less increasing, but especially so right after the Great Recession in 2009. Whereas the bottom 50%, the share of income for the bottom 50% has been about 28%, and it's been fairly constant from for several years, and then it has been declining after the Great Recession. Okay? If you look at the right panel, you see the post-tax national income. Okay, so you can see that when you compare the two figures, you see what does it mean to have a social democracy, or more in generally, what does it mean to have a progressive tax system where the richer pay marginally higher taxes. What you have is that the income inequality is dampened. Okay? So after looking at the taxes, the bottom 50% earns about 4% of income more than before, and the top 10% earns more or less 2 to 3% less. Okay, but regardless of the level differences, you can see there has been an increase in income inequality also in Denmark. Now, thanks to the website of the Piketty provided, we can also compare the income inequality across the world. Here is, for instance, the top 10% of national income share. You can see the darker red are more unequal countries where the top 10% earns between 50 to 70% of national income. And you see it's mostly happening in countries that are of low average income. And so you can see here the richer economies also tend to be less unequal. So this is not a surprise. This is what we've been observing. Countries that are poorer typically also have high degrees of income inequality, and countries that are richer have low degrees of income inequality. Okay? But you can see there are outliers here. There are countries that are richer, that have perhaps higher income inequality, say for instance the United States, and countries that are poorer, but that have reasonable level of income inequality, at least comparable to certain European countries like Ecuador or Argentina. Right? Now, this is very interesting, but I also wanted to show you other data, more specifically to Denmark, to show you that you can actually learn a lot if you explore the Statistic Denmark website, which in pretty much every lecture I encourage you to do. In this figure, I found the average disposable income for different types of workers. We have in blue and managers. In red, we have a high-level employees. In orange, medium-level employees. And in black, I guess, basic-level employees. So this is not surprising. We have the managers earn the most, then high-level earn a little less, medium level earn less or more, and the basic level earn the least. What's also interesting is that you can see that the income has been generally increasing for the four types of workers here reported, and there's some change happening during the Great Recession. What it looks to me is that the difference has been widening. Okay? And this is not surprising because this is consistent with the measure that we saw before about an increase in income inequality. Okay, so here what we're saying is that the managers were richer, have becoming more rich relative to how richer the basic level employees have gotten. Now, also always remember that there is a geographical element to income inequality. Here I'm plotting the average disposable income of the top 10% in Denmark, and you can see that there's heterogeneity in the income that the richest people earn across the different communes of Denmark. See, the richest 10% is located predominantly in the Copenhagen area. Here we have Aarhus, which is perhaps the top 10% is richer than the surrounding area. Right? But really, look at the website because you can track these figures over time. All right, so we have established that there exists income inequality. That income inequality has been on the rise, not only in the United States, but also in Denmark and also in other countries. So the question is, can trade explain this increase in income inequality? We cannot use the Ricardian model we studied last time to answer to this question, because in the Ricardian model, labor is the only factor of production. So there's no way of studying income inequality in that model, because all workers are better off with trade regardless of where they're from or where they work, right? However, we know that labor is not the only factor of production in the economy. And in fact, in this model, the model that we're going to uncover in today's lecture, we're going to expand upon the Ricardian model by introducing a second factor of production. We're going to mainly focus about capital owners, but you can also think that there is a high-skilled workers versus low-skilled workers, and also other potential factors of production. Now, by looking at the factor endowments of this factor of production, so how much labor, how much capital countries have, we're going to also infer something about the sources of comparative advantage. And we're going to be able to show that there are indeed winners and losers from international trade. We're going to start with the main assumption, and then we're going to first look at a small open economy, which takes international prices as given, and we're going to study some theorems. And this is conceptually the first part of the course, okay? The first part of the lecture, actually in one. Okay, although we're probably going to finish today with the bullet point number 2, the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, and in the next video, we're going to cover the rest. Now, the second part is going to be the full-fledged Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, where we're going to consider two open economies. And eventually, we're going to apply the model to study the China shock, the fact that China in 2001 entered the WTO. And by doing that, it effectively entered the international markets, and the rest has been history. So a lot of people have studied the effects of China entering the WTO, in particular or on labor all over the world, in particular on high-income countries, and in particular on low-skilled workers. Okay, and so we're going to tie what we study in this model with that shock so that we can interpret what China had meant for Denmark, for the US, and other rich countries. So let's start with the main assumptions. So we're going to be extending just a little bit the Ricardian model that we saw last time. So we're going to have two countries, home and foreign, as before, two goods, but this time we're going to have two factors of production. One factor is going to be labor, paid a wage, W, and also we're going to have capital. So we're going to think that there's going to be some capital owners that own a rental rate on capital, R. The rental rate on capital, you can think of it as the opportunity cost of capital, right? Now, both factors are perfectly mobile across industries. Okay? So this is perhaps a little difficult to digest because, well, we can think that labor perhaps is fairly mobile. You can imagine that once you graduate, you're going to be, economist, you're going to be able to work in several different sectors. Right? You could be consultant, you could be in an institution, you could work at the managerial level at any company, regardless of the sector. However, capital is perhaps a little less mobile, right? Because the machines they use in agriculture cannot overnight be moved and used to produce computers. And although perhaps computers could be used to produce several different factors, several different products. Okay? So up until last year, after talking about capital mobility, I would bring up the history of Nokia. And I would ask you, do you think it's feasible for a company to go from producing paper, toilet paper, to producing cell phones? Most people would react to the question quite puzzled. But that's pretty much the history of Nokia. It started as a wood pulp mill, then it went to the rubber business, and then it went onto electricity, and then it went on to cell phones, and now it's onto networks. Now with COVID, we've also seen other examples of capital mobility, the way we're thinking about it in this model. So the fact that capital and workers can move from the production of one good to another. So here are two Italian examples of two famous companies repurposing their production processes to produce COVID-related products. So for instance, Ferrari moved from the car industry to the production of valves for the ventilators, right? And Gucci started producing also masks, right? So you can see here, clearly Italy was dealing with COVID with a lot of style. So capital and labor are mobile across sectors, but they're immobile across countries. There's no foreign direct investments, and there's no migration in the model. We're still going to have consumers with identical homothetic preferences across countries, perfect competition, just like last time. And then countries are going to have the same production technology. This is going to be a key difference with the Ricardian model, because in the Ricardian model, countries differ in terms of their technology. This is very important, right? Because if countries were identical in terms of technology in the Ricardian model, there would be no trade. Right? The reason why countries trade in the Ricardian model is that they have technological differences. And by exploiting the difference in the technological differences across sectors, countries can gain from international trade. So what we're doing here is we're going to say, okay, we understand what are the effects of differences in technology across countries in terms of international trade. Here we're going to make our life a little more difficult. We're going to think that the technology is the same, and we're going to see whether two countries can actually still trade. And we're going to do that because we assume that the countries differ in terms of their factor endowments. So the number of workers and the number of units of capital that each country has is going to be different. We're going to see that, spoiler alert here, we're going to see that indeed generates a model in which two countries can trade. So L bar is going to be the labor endowment in the home country, how many workers the home country has, and K bar is the capital endowment in the home country. And L bar star and K bar star are the foreign endowments. Now, the technology is going to be represented by a production function, which is going to be slightly more sophisticated than the one we saw in the Ricardian model. In particular, to produce yi units of a good I, we're going to combine in a function f, capital Ki that you use in industry I, with the labor Li that you use in industry I. Here we're going to assume constant returns to scale, so that if you double capital and labor, you're going to double the output. And so here it's shown more generally. If you multiply by a scalar lambda, both capital and labor, you're going to multiply the total production by the same scalar. So there's going to be constant returns to scale, but decreasing returns to one factor, so that the obviously the marginal product of a factor j, so this would be the derivative of the production function with respect to factor j, is positive. Right? So increasing, if you hire an additional worker or if you employ an additional unit of machine, output increases. However, it increases at a decreasing rate. So the second derivative is negative. Right? So this captures the fact that when when you fix the number of units of capital that are available to workers, and you increase the number of workers, their productivity will increase. Sorry, their product will increase, but each worker will be somehow less efficient than before. And so the idea here is that, imagine that you are with you're working in your study groups. Right? If there's only one computer and one student can produce a certain output, if you add a new student and a new computer, assuming that the abilities are the same, output doubles. But if you add another student without adding additional computers, what you have is an increase in output, but the marginal product will be lower. Okay, the increase in output of an additional worker will be lower than the previous one. Now, the production possibility frontier will be represented by this concave function. Notice here that as we saw in the Ricardian model, the slope of the production possibility frontier is the opportunity cost of the good on the horizontal axis, good one. And here we have a concave, or more generally a curved PPF, because the unit labor requirements and the unit capital requirements are no longer constant. Okay? And so the reason for that is because of the diminishing marginal returns that we saw a second ago. As you move workers towards the production of Y1, you move along the production possibility frontier, output of Y1 will increase at a decreasing rate. And so that's why we don't have a a straight line for a production possibility frontier, but we're going to have this concave curve. Okay. Also notice that the opportunity cost of a good increases in the quantity of the good produced, right? So this is straightforward, right? If we move along the production possibility frontier, and we increase the production of Y1, we see that the slope of the production possibility frontier increases. So that means that the opportunity cost of good one is increasing, right? And this, why is this? And because of the diminishing marginal returns. Again, right? As you move capital and labor to the production of good one, you're gonna sooner or later encounter these diminishing marginal returns, so that you need more and more workers and more capital to increase output by the same amount. Okay? The roadmap is going to be the following. We're going to first focus on a small open economy that takes international prices of final goods as given. We're going to characterize the equilibrium. We're going to talk about two important concepts here, factor intensity and factor abundance, which are the Heckscher-Ohlin equivalent of the Ricardian comparative advantage, right? And then we're going to study the effects of a change in the international prices and a change in the factor endowments. So before we characterize the equilibrium, we're going to talk a little bit about unit costs. And so we saw before the production function. What we're actually going to work on is, rather than the production function, we're going to work on the unit cost, which is the dual image of that, really, right? So the unit cost, CI for good I, are a function of the wage W and the rental on capital R, and that is the combination, right, of L and KI of labor and capital, which minimizes total costs, WLI plus RKI, subject to the constraint that the output is greater or equal to 1. So this is the cost associated with producing 1 unit of output. Now, we're going to think in terms of unit factor requirements, just as we did in the Ricardian model. We're going to say that AIL, which is a function of the wage and the rental on capital, is the unit labor requirement, right? You know, optimal because obviously it depends on the level of the wage and the rental on capital. And then we have AIK, which is the unit capital requirement. Now, in the algebra that will follow, we're going to drop the argument WR for ease of notation, but keep that in mind because this is a key difference with the Ricardian model. In the Ricardian model, the AILs, well, there was no AIK, but if there were, that would also be constant. Instead, in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, these two vary and depends on the wage and the rental on capital. Now, we're going to write the unit cost with this general formation where the unit costs are the wage times the unit labor requirement plus the rental on capital times the unit capital requirement. Now we're going to show, and this will be useful for later, that the partial derivative of the unit cost with respect to the wage is actually equal to the unit labor requirement. All right, so this should be a bit surprising because, as we saw, the unit labor requirement depends on the wage and on the rental. Right? So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to prove that these right results, that the partial derivative of the unit cost with respect to the wage equals the unit labor requirement, and of course that the partial derivative of the unit cost with respect to the rental on capital equals the unit capital requirement. Let us rewrite the unit cost function here. CI is equal to the wage times the unit labor requirement, which of course are a function of wages and rental, plus the rental on capital times the unit capital requirement. So our goal for this exercise is to show that the derivative of the unit cost with respect to, say, the wage is just equal to the unit labor requirement. So we want to show the partial derivative of CI with respect to the wage, and obviously I'm gonna drop the arguments WR for ease of notation. I want to show that this is just equal to the unit labor requirement. Right? So this sort of makes sense. This means that if there is an increase in wage, the unit costs will increase by the number of units of labor that you're employing. Now, this also means that we're sort of ignoring any substitution between labor and capital that you might employ. And so let's see how we get this. So first, we want to take the total derivative of the unit cost function. So if we take the partial derivative of CI with respect to the wage, or we know that that's equal to AIL plus the wage times the partial derivative of AIL with respect to the wage plus the rent on capital times the partial derivative of the unit labor requirement for capital with respect to the wage. So the idea here is that if the wage will increase, your cost will increase by the number of workers that you're hiring. That's the unit requirement, AIL. And it's also going to change because, well, perhaps you will hire fewer workers, so you will save on the wage, or perhaps you will employ more capital, so that's the other fact captured. Okay, so basically what we want to show is that the terms that I'm gonna highlight in red, that this term plus this term here are equal to 0. So how can we do that? Well, first of all, let us look at the production function. So let's consider the production function evaluated at the unit labor requirements. Meaning, if I write Fi, the production function for good I, evaluated at the number of workers, AIL, and number of machines, AIK, what is that equal to? Well, pause for a second, think about it, and you'll see that the answer is 1. Okay. So AIL is the number of units of labor you need to produce 1 unit of output. AIK is the number of units of capital you need to produce 1 unit of output. So when you combine these two units, these unit requirements, you get that the total production is 1. So let's take the derivative with respect to the wages of the production function evaluated at the unit factor requirement. So what do we get? Well, first we get the marginal product of labor, FIL, so the derivative of the production function with respect to labor, and this is times the partial derivative of the unit labor requirement, AIL, with respect to the wage, plus the marginal product of capital times the partial derivative of AIK with respect to the wage. And we know that this has to be equal to 0. Okay? Beautiful. Now, let's take a step back and think a little bit about how factors of production are paid in this model. We know that factors of production are paid the value of their marginal product. In other words, the wage is actually equal to the price of a good PI times the marginal product of labor. And we also know that the rental on capital R is actually equal to the price, again, of a good, times the marginal product of capital, right? So using these two conditions, we can actually write the marginal product of labor as the wage over the price. And similarly, we can write the marginal product of capital as the ratio between the rental on capital and the price, PI. Okay. Now, we're gonna bring these results back into our production function, and let me write that equation is actually equation 1. Okay. So we're gonna substitute our result. FIL and F1IK in 1. Okay, so let's see that again. We're going to substitute our FIL and FIK back into 1. What is that going to give us? Well, that is going to give us that the wage times the partial derivative of the unit labor requirement with respect to the wage plus plus the rental on capital times the partial derivative of AIK with respect to the wage is actually equal to 0. Okay, and so what does this mean? Well, this means that we have proved what we wanted to prove. We wanted to prove that this term here was equal to 0. And in fact, that's what we did here. All right, so we've established that we've done our first algebra derivation, and the utility for that will be apparent later on. Now we can characterize the equilibrium. First, recall here we have a small open economy, so that the prices of final goods, P1 and P2, are taken as given. In the small open economy, we know the factor endowments, those are the fundamentals of the economy. Well, the equilibrium is going to be the quantities produced and consumed, since we're in autarky, and the factors prices, WR. What are the equilibrium conditions? Well, the first is the full employment condition. This is saying that the number of workers that work in Industry 1, the output of Industry 1 times the unit labor requirement in Industry 1, plus the number of workers that work in Industry 2 is equal to the total number of workers. And similarly for capital. Now the second equilibrium condition is the zero profit condition. The prices are equal to the unit costs. We characterized the unit cost before, right? And so, I mean, this sort of makes sense, right? So given the international prices, under some conditions, which we'll discuss, the two prices, P1 and P2, will determine the wage and the rental on capital. And then given the wage and the rental on capital, you can find the the unit cost and therefore the unit requirements for labor and capital in the two sectors. And then by solving the first system of equation, you can find the output for good 1 and good 2. Okay, now that is the equilibrium. Now we're going to need to talk a little bit about some important concepts here. The first is factor intensity. Now, factor intensity is something that has to do with production. And in particular, we're going to say that industry 1 is labor intensive if this condition holds. And so if the unit labor requirements for industry 1 divided by the unit capital requirements is greater than the unit labor requirements over the unit capital requirements for the other good. So industry 1 is labor intensive if it uses more labor relative to capital than industry 2. Okay? Now, similarly, industry 2 is therefore capital intensive because it uses relatively more capital than labor relative to industry 1. Okay? So if you compare, say, two industries, say computer production and shoe production, you know that computers uses 10 machines and shoe production uses 5 machines. You cannot say that computer production is capital intensive because you need to know the labor involved. And so if the number of units of machine per worker is larger in computer production, then computer production is capital intensive. And if shoe production has more workers per machines, then shoe production is relatively more, is labor intensive. Now, the second concept is about the endowments, and that is factor abundance. Now, I'm going to say that country 1 is labor abundant if the total number of workers over the total number of machines is larger than the equivalent for the foreign economy. So if in aggregate the home economy has more workers per machines than the foreign economy, then the home country is labor abundant. And similarly, the foreign country is capital abundant because it has more machines per workers relative to the home country. So here the typical trick question that one can think of is to say, okay, China has 1 billion workers, Denmark has 5 million workers. And obviously those are not the right numbers, but let's just assume that. Is China labor abundant? Well, you don't know. You can only answer that if you also know what is the capital endowment. Right? So China is labor abundant if the number of workers per machines in total is larger than the number of workers per machines in Denmark. Okay? Excellent. So that's it for today. We're gonna stop here and continue next time with the Heckscher-Ohlin model. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Ciao.